Put the items back and step outside.
Why? I'm shopping. I haven't finished yet.
Someone reported you acting suspicious. You've been here too long.
I've been here 15 minutes. That's suspicious?
Are you leaving a customer? I'm buying groceries, so I need to remove you.
Don't make this difficult.
Outside. Now.
The security cameras at Freshco captured every word, every movement, every second. Outside in the parking lot, a 14-year-old boy sat in the passenger seat watching through the glass. He had no idea what was about to happen to his father. Officer Derek Malone had absolutely no idea that the man standing in that aisle had spent 15 years leading soldiers through combat zones and earned medals most officers will never see. That mistake would cost the city $1.5 million and cost Malone everything. Before we continue, drop a comment and tell me where you were watching from. Stories like this one need to be heard. If this is your first time here, hit subscribe. The truth doesn't disappear just because no one's talking about it. Let me tell you who David Washington actually is. 37 years old, Colonel, United States Army, Fort Riverside, 15 years of service, 3 deployments. Bronze Star, in 2018, he coordinated a defense operation under fire that pulled 14 soldiers out alive. His security clearance sits at top secret/SCY, a level most civilian law enforcement will never be vetted for in their entire careers. Tonight, he is not thinking about any of that. His assistant of 6 years is retiring next week. She asked for nothing. David decided to throw her a small party anyway. His wife texted him a short list. Cake, candles, a few things from the canned goods aisle. He walked into Freshco at 6:34 p.m., grabbed a cart, started reading labels, texted his wife back about which brand to get. That was enough. The cashier was 20 years old. His name was Tyler. He watched David move slowly through the aisle, check his phone twice, compare 2 cans of soup. Tyler felt something was off. He could not say what. He could not point to a single action. He called 911 anyway. The dispatcher asked what made the man suspicious. Tyler said he had been in the store a while, was looking around, kept checking his phone. That was the entire complaint. A man shopping carefully and texting his wife. Officer Derek Malone took the call. He arrived expecting a shoplifter, maybe someone casing the store. He found a middle-aged man in a jacket reading a nutrition label, but Malone had already decided. Once he made up his mind, facts couldn't change it. David looked at Malone, calm, still. Officer, I'm a customer. I'm buying groceries. What law am I breaking? Malone said someone reported suspicious activity, said David needed to step outside for questioning. David did not move. His military training does not leave you when you take off the uniform. 15 years of high-pressure situations, hostile environments, split-second decisions, men looking to him for calm in the middle of chaos had built something in David Washington that a grocery store confrontation was not going to rattle. He set his cart to the side, stood straight, and asked the question every officer is trained to answer, but many hope they never hear. Am I being detained or am I free to go? Malone hesitated. You're being questioned as part of an investigation. David's voice did not rise, did not sharpen, just steady. Investigation of what crime? Be specific. What do you suspect me of doing? Malone said, suspicious behavior. Someone called it in. What behavior specifically? What action have I taken that is suspicious? Malone listed them. Being in the store too long, looking around, checking his phone. David let that sit for 1 second. So I am suspicious for shopping slowly, looking at products, and texting my wife about dinner. Officer, do you hear yourself? That is not an insult. That is a legal argument, and it is airtight. Here is what Malone could not answer, because there is no answer under the Fourth Amendment. A law enforcement officer cannot detain a citizen without reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. Not a feeling, not a call from a nervous cashier. Actual articulable facts pointing to an actual crime. Walking slowly in a store is not a crime. Reading a label is not a crime. Responding to a text message is not a crime. David Washington knew this, not because he looked it up once, because his legal training at Georgetown had covered exactly these scenarios. The boundaries of Terry stops the threshold for reasonable suspicion, the difference between a consensual encounter and an unlawful detention. Malone was standing on the wrong side of that line, and he did not know it. The aisle was no longer empty. An elderly couple had stopped their cart at the far end watching. A woman with 2 kids stood near the cereal section, not moving. A younger man near the soup cans had his phone up recording. By now, 9 people had stopped what they were doing and were paying attention. At the end of the aisle stood 2 men who had said nothing yet. One was a civil attorney named Robert Graves, who recognized immediately what he was watching. The other was a retired police chief from a neighboring county named Frank Dellums, who had seen enough bad police work in his career to recognize it from 30 feet away. Both of them were watching Malone. Neither of them looked impressed. The store manager, Phil, 12 years running this location, knew most of the regulars by face, walked over from the registers. "Officer, is there a problem here? This gentleman shops here regularly. I don't see any issue." Malone turned to Phil. Said Tyler, the cashier, had called in the complaint. Phil looked over at Tyler, asked him directly what the problem was. Tyler couldn't say, just that something seemed off. Couldn't point to a single thing David had done wrong. Phil turned back to Malone. "Officer, I don't see anything here. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." Malone heard it. He understood what Phil was telling him. He didn't care. He had responded to a call. He had identified a subject. He had given a lawful order in his mind, and the subject had refused to comply. Backing down now in front of 9 witnesses and 3 cameras felt like losing. Malone was not thinking about the Fourth Amendment. He was thinking about his authority. That was the problem, and it was about to become everyone's problem. He had passed the point where this ends quietly. Malone reached for David's arm. David stepped back. 1 step, clean, controlled. No aggression, no raised voice. Just a man refusing to be touched without legal justification. "Do not touch me. I do not consent to physical contact." Malone grabbed his wrist anyway. That was the moment. Not the argument, not the back and forth about reasonable suspicion. This moment right here was when Derek Malone crossed from bad judgment into actionable civil rights violation. The body camera on his chest recorded every second of it. David did not pull away, did not twist, did not raise his voice above the calm, measured tone he had held since the beginning. He simply went completely still, the way a man does when he has decided that every movement he makes is evidence, and he intends to give the other side nothing to work with. "Officer, I am not resisting. I am standing still. You have no probable cause for this detention. If you place me under arrest, you are committing false arrest. I want that on the record." Malone pulled out the handcuffs. Several people in the aisle gasped. The man near the soup cans moved closer with his phone. Robert Graves, the civil attorney at the end of the aisle, stopped breathing for a moment, already calculating what he was watching. The cuffs went on. Click, click. The sound carried through the aisle, through the store, past the registers, past the automatic doors. Outside in the parking lot, a 14-year-old boy sitting in the passenger seat heard nothing. But he saw everything. He saw his father standing between 2 shelves of canned goods. He saw a uniformed officer behind him. He saw his father's hands disappear behind his back. He got out of the car. He ran. He hit the front doors of Freshco at full speed, pushing through, calling out, and a second officer stepped directly into his path and stopped him at the entrance. "Hands up. Don't come inside. Stay back." The boy was 14 years old. He was not a threat to anyone. He was a child watching his father get handcuffed in a grocery store for buying cake. He stood at the door and could not move forward. David could not see him from where he was standing. But he knew. A father always knows. He kept his voice steady, kept his chin up, and he spoke loudly and clearly for every camera in that building. "I am not resisting. I am being forcibly detained by this officer for the act of grocery shopping. I have committed no crime. I have been given no lawful basis for this arrest. My name is Colonel David Washington, United States Army, Fort Riverside, service number follows." Malone told him to be quiet. "I have a First Amendment right to speak. You cannot compel my silence." Malone began moving him toward the exit. David walked, back straight, head up, the way he had walked through villages in Afghanistan with complete dignity, in conditions that had no dignity in them at all. As they passed the registers, David spoke to Phil, to the customers, to the phone still recording. "My name is Colonel David Washington. I am stationed at Fort Riverside. I have done nothing wrong. This is a false arrest. Please post the videos. Contact military legal assistance. Make sure this is documented." At the front entrance, the second officer stepped aside to let them through. David's son stood there. Father and son locked eyes for 3 seconds. David gave a single small nod. The nod that says, I am all right. Do not be afraid. I have this. Then they were outside. In the parking lot, evening shoppers stopped walking. People stared. Some looked away. Most did not. More phones came out. More cameras. More evidence. The city of Riverside was building its own case against itself, and it didn't even know it yet. Malone opened the rear door of his patrol car. Before placing David inside, he did what procedure requires. He asked if David had anything in his pockets that could cause injury. David said wallet, phone, car keys, and his military identification card, which would have told Malone everything he needed to know 20 minutes ago if Malone had ever bothered to ask. Malone reached into David's jacket pocket, pulled out the items one by one. Wallet, phone, keys, and then the ID. He held it up, looked at it, the photograph, the rank, the service number. The holographic security seals across the surface, 5 layers of verification used precisely because this card needs to be impossible to fake. Colonel, United States Army. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not a gray area. This was a full colonel in the United States Army standing handcuffed in a grocery store parking lot for shopping. Malone stared at the card for 4 seconds. Then he put David in the back seat and closed the door. At the end of the aisle inside, Frank Dellums, retired police chief, 28 years on the force, a man who had seen 400 misconduct cases and knew exactly what each one looked like at the beginning, turned to Robert Graves and said quietly, "That man just made the worst decision of his career." The drive to the station took 9 minutes. Malone said nothing. David said nothing. The radio filled the silence with other officers handling other calls. The world kept moving like nothing had happened. It had happened. Lieutenant Sandra Okafor was at the front desk when they walked in. 21 years with Riverside PD. She had processed enough arrests to read a situation in under 10 seconds. She looked at Malone, looked at David, looked at the military ID Malone placed on the desk in front of her. She picked it up. She read it once, then read it again. Then she looked at Malone with an expression that was not anger yet, just the very controlled face of someone who already knows exactly how bad this is and is deciding how to handle the next 60 seconds carefully. "Step into the hallway with me." She did not raise her voice. In the hallway, she asked Malone 4 questions. Did you run his name through the database before the arrest? No. Did you call dispatch to get more detail on the complaint number? Did you observe any actual criminal behavior? No. Did you have any evidence beyond a vague call from a cashier? 4 questions, 4 answers, all the same. She came back to the desk, told the officer nearby to remove the handcuffs, told David he was free to go. No charges would be filed. David rubbed his wrist where the metal had pressed for the past 53 minutes. Then he asked in the patient tone of a man explaining something to someone who should already know it for a copy of the arrest documentation. Okafor said there would be no formal arrest report since he was being released without charges. David said being handcuffed, transported to a station, and brought before a booking desk constitutes an arrest under Illinois law and department policy, regardless of whether charges are ultimately filed and documentation is required. She knew he was right. She printed the incident report, handed it to him with her business card. David thanked her for her professionalism, specifically, on the record. Then he turned to Malone and told him he would be filing a federal civil rights complaint under 42 U.S.C., Section 1983, that the First, Fourth, and 14th Amendment violations were documented on multiple devices and that he suggested Malone speak with a lawyer before morning. He walked out at 7:51 p.m., 53 minutes after a cashier's phone call. By the time David reached the sidewalk and called his wife, the videos were already moving. 6 customers had recorded the incident from inside Freshco. 4 security cameras had captured it from different angles. Malone's own body camera had recorded every word and every movement and every second, from the moment he walked into that aisle to the moment the handcuffs went on in the parking lot. 11 separate recordings, all telling the same story. By 9 p.m., the footage had been shared across 3 platforms. By midnight, it had been picked up by 2 regional news outlets. By morning, it was national. The Internal Affairs Division of Riverside PD opened a formal investigation before sunrise. They assigned it to Captain Marcus Webb, 26 years on the force. He pulled everything. The fresh footage, the customer videos, Malone's body cam, the dispatch recording of Tyler's original call. Then he pulled Malone's history. What he found was not a single bad night. It was a pattern that had been sitting in plain sight for 3 years waiting for someone to look. 51 of Malone's 67 suspicious activity stops over the past 3 years had involved black individuals. Riverside's population is 21% black. 3 excessive force complaints, 1 written warning for conduct. Each incident reviewed individually had looked marginal, borderline, explainable. Put together, the pattern was not marginal, it was systematic. Nobody had connected the dots. Not because the dots were hidden, because nobody had looked for them. The JAG office at Fort Riverside was contacted within 2 hours of David's release. The Army's legal division handles exactly these situations, and they move quickly. The NAACP Legal Defense Fund called the following morning. The city's own attorneys reviewed the footage that same week and sent a single internal memo to the police chief. 3 sentences. The last one read, "We cannot defend this in court. Malone was suspended without pay, pending the outcome of the investigation." The footage had not left any room for interpretation. Here's what I want to ask you directly before we go further. Malone will lose his job. The city will write a check for $1.5 million. Do you think that is enough, or should there have been criminal charges? Tell me what you think in the comments. I want to hear it. The settlement was announced 11 weeks after that Wednesday evening at Freshco. $1.5 million paid by the city of Riverside. Every penny documented in public record. Derek Malone did not fight it. His resignation letter went in the same week the settlement was finalized. It said he was leaving to pursue other opportunities. Everyone who read it knew what it actually said. He never worked in law enforcement again. Last anyone confirmed, he was doing private security work at a warehouse facility, making roughly half his officer's salary. He has no public social media presence. According to people who know him, he still believes he was just doing his job. He never said he was wrong. The settlement was not just a check. David's attorney made sure of that. Riverside PD was required to implement mandatory bias training for every active officer within 90 days. A civilian review board was established with actual authority to review misconduct complaints, not just observe them. The department now conducts quarterly statistical analysis of all stops broken down by race, with results submitted to an independent oversight committee. Any officer whose stop pattern deviates significantly from population demographics triggers an automatic review. The system that let Malone make 51 racially skewed stops over 3 years without anyone noticing that system no longer exists in Riverside, at least not officially. Tyler, the cashier who made the original call, posted a public apology video 2 weeks after the story broke nationally. He said he had acted on assumptions he had never examined, said he was working on it. Some people accepted it, many did not. He left Freshco shortly after, deleted his accounts, moved to a different city. He was 20 years old when he made a phone call that set everything in motion. He will be living with that for a long time. Phil, the store manager, kept his job. He was one of the first witnesses to tell investigators that David had done nothing wrong, and his statement was part of the evidence package that made the city's legal position untenable. He still runs the same Freshco location. Frank Dellums, the retired police chief who watched from the end of the aisle, gave a formal statement to Internal Affairs. His account from a man with 28 years of law enforcement experience carried significant weight in the investigation. He was later invited to consult on the bias training curriculum Riverside PD was required to implement. He accepted. Robert Graves, the civil attorney who stood beside him that night, sent David a handwritten note after the settlement. It said, "You handled that better than most lawyers I know." David Washington is still at Fort Riverside. He is currently being considered for promotion to brigadier general. The review board cited his conduct specifically, his composure, legal precision, and documentation discipline during the incident as evidence of the kind of leadership the Army values at that level. He still shops at Freshco every couple of weeks. Same aisle, same cart. Phil always stops to say hello. His son submitted his West Point application 4 months ago. David sat with him while he wrote the personal statement. His son wrote about watching his father walk out of that store with his head up, about what it means to know your rights, about the difference between dignity and compliance. David tells every junior officer who comes through his command the same three things. Know your rights, stay calm, document everything. Not because the system always works, but because documentation is the only reason it worked that night. The pasta aisle at Fresh Co. looks exactly the same as it did that Wednesday evening. Same shelves, same lights, same products. But something happened in there. Someone stood firm. And because of that, one city had to change. If you believe every American, regardless of rank, regardless of race, deserves to be treated as a citizen and not a suspect, share this story. That is the only thing that makes sure the next person has a better chance than David did. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And tell me this, what is the most important thing Colonel Washington's story taught you? I read every single comment.